Hello, and welcome to our podcast, Acts, Verse by Verse, brought to you by Teleios. This captivating podcast will detail each verse of the book of Acts, which chronicles the early history of the Christian church after Jesus' ascension into heaven. Thanks for joining us in this exciting biblical journey.
Hi, I'm William Stewart, co-founder of Teleios. Welcome back to our verse-by-verse study on the book of Acts. We're in chapter 13, the exciting start of the first missionary journey by Paul. Accompanying him is Barnabas and John Mark, and they have set off first to the coast of the Mediterranean coast, around northern Lebanon. What is it today? Northern Lebanon. Then to Cyprus, where they met Bar Jesus, and God demonstrated his wrath upon him. And we come now to verse 13, where they go to the mainland, Asia Minor. So let's pick up the action and see the spreading of the church to the diaspora of the Jews and the Gentiles. And now when Paul and his company, loosed from Paphos, that's on Cyprus, they came to Perga and Pamphylia. That's a Roman province in southern Asia Minor, what is now today Turkey. John departed from them, and we don't know why. We find out some information in Acts 15, where Paul and Barnabas argue over him. Paul was determined not to take him because he proved unreliable. We find out later in the end of Colossians, he became reliable, thanks be to God, and Paul thought favorably of him. But at this point, for some reason, he leaves, and it does not reflect well upon him in Paul's eyes. I'm sure probably for a good reason. So they departed and went to Antioch in Pisidia. Again, this is not the big Antioch in Syria. It's in southern Asia Minor, a different Antioch. They went to the synagogue. This is typical, as Paul says in Romans 1 and 2, to the Jew first and to the Greek. This was his process, I think, again, limited to this time, and that's a controversial statement. But he went to the Jew first, as Christ did, as Paul was an extension, in my view, of Christ's ministry to peoples outside Judea, to the Jewish diaspora in the Greek living world, and of course to the Gentiles. He's the apostle to the Gentiles. He went to the synagogue, and they had a reading for the law and the prophets. I'm paraphrasing just a little here. In verse 16, then Paul stood up and addressed the synagogue of men of Israel, otherwise the Jews, and that fear God. I think he's speaking here of Gentiles who feared God, who attended the synagogue. And he begins a review of Israel's history for a purpose of presenting the gospel. This is one of the three great reviews of Israel history in the New Testament. One we saw with Stephen in Acts 7. There's another one in Hebrews 11, the Great Hall of Faith. This one in chapter 13 in Acts differs from Stephen's, I'm sure in many ways, but I think most apparent is that Stephen, the deacon, focused on Moses. Paul will focus on David. And I don't know all the reasons for this. I think that the major reason in my mind is that Stephen was preaching to the Pharisees in Judea who held tight to the law and, of course, added their own words to the law. That law was a part of their power base and their finances. And Stephen was making the point that they would really not obeyed it and disobeyed God in rejecting Christ. So he went right to the heart of the matter for them. Here the emphasis is David, who was the progenitor of the line of Christ. So this is a huge difference. These people are apart from Judea, and he's making the emphasis of the importance of David, who is important to all Jews, as the progenitor of Christ. And he basically covers the time of the law, but in a sense uses it only as a foundation for talking about David. So let's go through this, and we'll talk perhaps about the reasons why. So he says in verse 17, people of Israel chose our fathers. So these would be the patriarchs, I think, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, remember, it was the Abrahamic covenant that is really foundational for Scripture. In it, really, the rest of Scripture and what it deals with and resolves is based out of this covenant. Otherwise, the nation of Israel, who provided Messiah, and God will complete his promises to them. And of course, the Messiah himself. So this is an everlasting covenant. And so he continues in, and they dwelt as among strangers in the land of Egypt. So he's talking about their enslavement, and his strength brought them out of it. So we're in Exodus and leading Israel out of Egypt by Moses, and exalted his people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt. As I read that, they suffered 40 years in the desert, verse 18, in the wilderness. He suffered, otherwise being Moses, suffered with the manners of the Israelites. And when he had destroyed the 7 nations in the land of Canaan, so again, this is where Moses had brought Israel to the land to take it. In the books of Joshua, really in the book of Joshua, he destroyed the 7 nations. These 7 nations are mentioned in Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 and 2, and they are the Hittites, the Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. So he specifically remembers this verse. And divided them by land or by lot, each tribe to receive their apportionment. This is really the last half of the book of Joshua. And after that, he gave them the judges. This is in the book of Judges, about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. So this brings us to 1 Samuel and Samuel's ministry. And afterward, they desired a king. So they no longer wanted to be under God, but wanted their own king. This is 1 Samuel 8. And God gave them Saul, son of Cis, from the tribe of Benjamin, for about 40 years. So this really encompasses the book of 1 Samuel. So what's he doing here? Well, as I mentioned, he's providing a foundation for King David. This is the time where the law was given. Coming to King David provides the line of Christ. So how does all this fit together? This is called the Davidic covenant, over which we'll read, versus the Mosaic covenant with Moses. There's a 4th covenant, also, we're talking about the major covenants. There's some more minor ones. The new covenant in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, really when Christ comes again. That's future. So if we think of the Abrahamic covenant like a generalized contract for a series of services between companies, okay, this lasts forever until a certain goal is reached, or perhaps the contract is terminated. But within this overall contract, service contract, will be work orders, specific work orders, which can end within the scope of the contract. So the Abrahamic covenant was like a service contract to provide salvation through Messiah, which is everlasting. Whereas the work order, the Mosaic covenant, was a work order to provide for the Jewish people. It provided them a governmental organization. It provided them a spiritual organization and taught them about Messiah. And it was only there until it was fulfilled when Messiah came. Romans 10:4 and other verses. And that work order then was complete. Christ fulfilled that work order, but the overall service contract still existed. Now, David's covenant is part of that service contract, and the line of kings is everlasting, and it doesn't suspend. So that's a difference between the Mosaic covenant, it's a temporary work order for a specific purpose, versus the service contract, which is everlasting. The new covenant is also part of that service contract. Hope that makes some sense for you business-minded people. So what we have, this foundation is talking about the Mosaic covenant, which leads up to David. And this is a controversial statement, but really I think the major purpose of Israel was to provide David and Messiah. If I had to say one purpose, that's what it was. And they did it, and David was confirmed as king and his eternal line through Messiah. God was faithful to help them do this despite all their sin. Okay, what we've seen today is the beginning of Paul's sermon in the synagogue at Antioch in Pisidia. He's going to talk extensively about David, leading to salvation. But we've seen today how he's provided a foundation, a background to David to set him in context, reviewing briefly scriptures up until that time of David. Okay, thank you for joining me today. I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye for now.
Thanks for listening to this episode of our podcast, Acts Verse by Verse. We hope you found the teachings both interesting and informative. Join us next week for another exciting episode. To listen to all episodes, please visit our website, teleiosresearch.com.